gym that he used his vines to begin swinging from, almost as though he had suddenly become a Mankey. This particular strategy had been a must since Ethan, after overcoming his surprise at seeing such an evasive tactic, commanded Ponyta to unleash a continual stream of red-hot flamethrowers up at the rafters. However, their strategy had not merely been centered on evasion. Planning a step ahead all the while, Ash had called for Bulbasaur to use Leech Seed every time he swung from one beam to the next to avoid the fire. This caused several small seed pods to fall all over the battlefield below, almost like brown drops of botanical rain. A winning formula having formed in his mind's eye, Ash had stunned everyone by telling Bulbasaur to come down from the rafters. Ethan, though, while not understanding, didn't hesitate to take their chance and had Ponyta use a non-stop barrage of both takedown and flame charge to defeat Bulbasaur once and for all. While, at first, it seemed as though Ash was only allowing Bulbasaur to run and avoid Ponyta, it soon became clear what his goal was. As soon as the dogged grass type backed himself up toward a couple of the leech seed pods that had fallen close together earlier on, the time came to spring the trap. In a move that had required perfect timing, Ash yelled for Bulbasaur to strike the floor with his vines, which sent him catapulting backward just as Ponyta approached using another flame charge. Simultaneously, he also ordered Bulbasaur to use poison powder while in the air. This sent a plume of thick, purple, poisonous spores to puff out like a wall in front of him. Ethan, seeing the impending threat, had urgently shouted for his last Pokémon to halt before it could run head-on into the poisonous cloud. And while Ponyta did so, it also placed the fiery equine right over top of the scattered leech seed pods. Since all it took was a single touch to the sensitive outer shell of the seeds to activate them, and one of Ponyta's hooves did indeed graze a pod, it immediately came to life and wrapped its vines around the fire-type's leg. As the burning electrical jolt of the vine's energy-sapping powers took effect, Ponyta had cried out in pain and reared back before falling to the floor. In the process it also touched the other pods around it, causing a veritable swarm of those same dangerous vines to shoot out and completely ensnare Ponyta in their stamina-stealing clutches. With so many leech seed pods activated at one time, it had only taken seconds to completely drain Ponyta into a sound state of total unconsciousness. Not only sealing Bulbasaur's victory over a type-superior opponent but also soundly putting Ash in the winner's circle of the match. After the gym battle had officially come to a close and all the post-match congratulations had been given, by both Ethan and Ash's friends, the fancy and posh gym leader praised his victorious challenger. Specifically lauding Ash's ingenuitive battle prowess and both he and his Pokémon's ability to reflexively act so quickly in the heat of battle. Due to all of that, Ethan had rewarded the young trainer from Palette with the Reflex badge. Rather surprisingly, since the gym leader himself was apparently so posh, the badge was quite plain. It was golden in color and shaped like something between a crescent moon and a claw. With another gym badge earned, Ash and his friends had soon departed once again and set out for their final detour before Vermilion City. Caston Village had been the name of the final sub-destination that housed Ash's next gym battle challenge. It was a rather small community, situated deep within the forests that stretched between Sarah's City and Vermilion City, which were themselves two of the largest coastal cities on that particular side of the bay. The appearance of the village was made to resemble a community built into the wild and untamed heart of the forest, instead of through it. The houses were simple log homes and the shops were just local, family-owned businesses. There was a small Pokémon Center and also a Pokémart located in the rustic town, but that was about all one would see there concerning anything else that could also be found in the more populated areas of Kanto. In all actuality, there were more towering trees to be found than homes and shops. The Pokémon Gym was located in a large and very unique-looking log building, which had been even deeper in the forest and boasted a very wild, natural decorative style. The Pokémon League emblem above the door actually had vines growing around it, as if to drive home the primitive design. Oddly enough, the log gym seemed to be built in such a way that there were several levels to it, each one ascending higher than the last in the back of the rustic-looking dwelling. The elevating levels almost resembled a set of stairs ascending into the treetops. Once inside the gym, Ash and his friends immediately found themselves walking through a long hallway made entirely of cherry red, finely varnished wood. While there had been doors found sporadically here and throughout the long hall, they would always inevitably come across one that had the Pokémon League emblem above the frame. Going through it is the most likely correct choice. They would find a set of stairs leading up to the next level of the building and yet another hallway they had to traverse. This went on for about 3 or 4 levels until, finally, they went through the last door and found themselves standing outside on a wooden platform covered by an arched overhang. And there, laid out before them, had been a huge battlefield made entirely of logs. The battlefield in question was out in the open and surrounded by all the immense trees in the forest on every side. In a unique twist to anything any of them had seen yet, the ring was elevated quite high up in the air and was attached to several of the large nearby trees by heavy-duty logging chains. There was a thick white netting draped around the battlefield like a makeshift cage, and while the underside of the ring was made of thick, rounded logs, the top of them that served as the ring floor had been neatly shaved down smooth. The treetops above provided a thick green canopy, like a natural ceiling, which concealed the sky from the view of those down on the battlefield. Moreover, there was a log bridge, the sides of which were also girded by netting, that lead out onto the ring. The gym leader, who by happenstance had already been out on the battlefield when they arrived, was a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s and had long green hair that was tied back into a ponytail. She wore a brown V-neck short-sleeved short and gray cargo shorts with a brown leather belt across the waist. She also wore brown hiking boots on her feet. The woman wore no makeup, but it did not detract from her natural beauty, and her eyes were a deep, rich brown. Her expression relayed a sense of someone who was wild, vivacious and very energetic. Her name had been Liza, and she spoke with a rather girlish tone of perpetual excitement in her voice. She specialized in any Pokémon she thought went well with nature, her exact words, and would say no more on the matter when pressed. After greetings and pleasantries had been properly dispensed, the match officially started by Ash facing off against Liza's Parasect with his own Paras. Before the day of the battle had even arrived, Ash already made the decision that he wanted to use more of the Pokémon he had captured at Melanie's cottage for his next gym bout. Concerning Paras, specifically, it was the boy's first time battling with the grass bug type, and he wanted to see just how effective its training regimen had thus far been. According to Professor Oak, Paras trained just as hard at the lab as Ash's other Pokémon, and the upcoming battle was the best way to see just how far along he had truly come. The battle itself had ended up being a near constant blur of movement the entire time, neither opponent giving an inch. Parasect did want to lose against its pre-evolved form, and Paras refused to lose, period. Parasect had attacked relentlessly with nearly every move it knew: Spore, Slash, Fury Cutter and even Giga Drain. Paras, however, was faster and smaller and managed to dodge most of the attacks. Save for a random swipe here and there from Fury Cutter or just barely getting caught by an energy-sapping tendril of Giga Drain. Paras had luckily been able to free himself each time by using Slash to cut the tendrils off, but Ash had known they could not keep up the game of avoid and evade forever. Parasect had already landed a few hits on Paras, and he himself had only managed to graze his evolved form with Fury Cutter or Slash a handful of times. Thankfully though, an idea had soon come to Ash by watching both Pokémon circle each other. He had realized that Paras did not need to outmuscle Parasect, merely outmaneuver it. Switching gears therefore completely, he had Paras focus exclusively on speed and get in close to Parasect. Liza had her own Pokémon use Slash as a counter, but Paras merely utilized his superior agility to leap out of the way. Right on the heels of that, Ash had ordered him to get underneath Parasect and use a rapid Fury Cutter on its legs. The tactic worked beautifully, and after brutally slicing at the larger Pokémon's legs, Paras managed to quickly scuttle out from underneath of it just as Parasect fell to the ground. While Liza tried to have her downed Pokémon use Giga Drain as a protective counter from where it was laying, Ash was quicker and commanded for Paras to get in close enough to launch a spore attack instead. The yellowy cloud of sleep-inducing toxins were released much too quickly and at too close a range for Parasect to hope to evade. Therefore, Liza had only been able to look on helplessly as her Pokémon was swiftly put to sleep by the very move that was known to be its kind's specialty. Rather it was the success of an effective technique or the excitement of battle, Ash knew not, but at that very same moment Paras' entire body started to glow blue just before several thrashing, whipping tendrils of semi-translucent energy appeared from within him. And in that very moment, in a twist of nothing but sheer irony, Ash realized that Paras had just learned how to use the very move in which Parasect had been using to relentlessly harass him the entire battle. Smirking in triumph, Ash had simply risen his fist and called for Paras to use his new move, and so he did. The dark blue tendrils of Giga Drain sped across the short distance separating the two bug Pokémon and wrapped themselves around Parasect, quickly and efficiently sapping its energy like a Heracross to pollen. The attack was so powerful it actually lifted Paras' sleeping evolved form up into the air and drained it dry of every last bit of its stamina. By the time the siphoning process was finished, Parasect had fallen simply to the hard log ground below, soundly defeated. The final face-off of the gym match after Paras' greatly praised victory ended up being a double battle. Ash had wanted to see how well his two female Rattata battled together since Professor Oak, having observed some of their training, seemed to speak highly of their dual skill. Liza had been more than happy to oblige his request and took on his two Rattata with her remaining Pokémon, Exeggcute and Tangela. The entire battle ended up revolving around Ash having both Rattata rely on speed, evasiveness and agile tactics to avoid the many attacks that were thrown their way, all while being able to counter with their own. Exeggcute and Tangela were both grass types and by extension that meant they knew a fair few energy draining and status affecting moves that Ash was very wary of. At certain points he had both Rattata move, dodge and attack separately so they wouldn't be as easy of a target as they would have been together. Since they both knew the exact same attacks he would have them alternate which ones they used in order to keep their opponents somewhat off balance. When they would get in close after dodging attacks such as Tangela's Vine Whip, or Exeggcute's Confusion and Seed Bomb, they would both use quick attacks simultaneously in order to get in fast and hit their opponents. After that they would almost always follow up by using a move such as Hyper Fang or Crunch to deal off a final dose of reasonable damage. However, during one of their double quick attack charges, Liza had Tangela use Razor Leaf to distract them just before Vine Whip came in behind the leafy decoy and swept their feet out from under them. The duo attacks worked and while both Rattata were laying sprawled out on the ground, she had Tangela pin them down with its vines. Exeggcute then followed it up by barraging the rodent sisters with a painful series of seed bomb attacks. At last, Liza called for a double stun spore from both of her Pokémon to clench victory for them. Ash though, seeing the impending disaster, had yelled urgently for both Rattata to use Hyper Fang on the vines holding them down. Liza had not been expecting such a tactic and neither was Tangela as the twin female Rattata used their painfully sharp incisors to chomp down on the vines holding them. No sooner did Tangela withdraw its vines in order to avoid being gnawed on and Ash commanded both Rattata to use quick attack and focus energy to escape the thick cloud of paralyzing spores that were floating their way. Since the double stun spore attack had come from Tangela and Exeggcute, who were positioned a short ways apart from one another, there was a small gap down the center of the battlefield that had not been blanketed by the curtain of paralytic powder. Therefore, using focus energy to harness all their strength into their legs and quick attack for a burst of raw speed, the dynamic sisterly duo was able to run in a perfectly straight line right down the center of the battlefield, each one harmoniously in step behind the other and successfully avoiding the harmful spores. Once they were clear from the immediate danger, Ash gave the command for them to separate off into different directions. The one he ordered to go after Tangela and attack with Pursuit and Hyper Fang. The other was given the charge to strike Exeggcute with quick attack. The best thing about fighting the egg cluster Pokémon was that it had one glaring weakness. Namely, there was that single, lone egg that didn't move or do anything and was, more or less, merely an oval-shaped target. For this reason he directed Rattata to use Crunch on the defenseless egg, but just as she leapt in the air to execute the attack, the other, heads, of Execute used Confusion to freeze her in midair. The raven-haired trainer of Rattata knew she was in trouble and had quickly looked over to see how her sister was faring. Having successfully managed to tackle Tangela with Pursuit, she had found herself gnawing away at the grass-type's vines with Hyper Fang whilst her opponent furiously attempted to shake her off. It was at that moment that Ash saw it. A way, wildly unorthodox as it might have been, to turn the tide of the whole battle. He spotted a small opening in Tangela's vines that Rattata had succeeded in prying apart with her teeth. In a strategic maneuver that Liza would never forget all her days as a gym leader, the unpredictably strategic rookie ordered Rattata to jump inside of Tangela through the small opening in its viney body that had been made. Demonstrating that, even when they did not understand their trainer's methods, they obeyed regardless, Rattata had not wasted a second and simply leapt inside of her opponent. Liza herself had only been to stare in a gaping state of disbelief as the destructive little rat began wreaking havoc on her poor Pokémon from the inside. Of course, while not wholly original since his first, male Rattata had done something quite similar to Brock's Onyx during their own gym battle, Ash found himself thankful once again that Rattata were so easily able to fit into small, confined spaces. Although, as he watched his Pokémon work vigorously at bringing her opponent down from within, he had noticed something rather peculiar. Whenever Rattata attacked a certain part of Tangela's inner anatomy, he saw certain of its vines swing around wildly. Once again banking on the weird and unconventional, he had called for her to try and take control of those same vines and use them to attack Execute, who was still holding her sister incapacitated. Showing a level of sharp keenness of mind that made her trainer proud, Rattata managed to take control of said vines with her teeth and then manipulated them into swinging around and trussing Execute up like a toros by a ranch hand. The other grass type had most certainly not expected its own partner to attack it, and that immediately interrupted Execute's focus enough for Rattata to break free of the telekinetic hold she had been trapped by. As soon as her paws touched the ground, Rattata wasted no time in taking advantage of the opportunity her sister had given her and lunged forward, clamping her teeth down on the unprotected egg with Crunch just as she had earlier intended to do. It was in the successful execution of that attack that Ash saw why the other eggs guarded their underdeveloped sibling so fiercely. It was the source of their psychic power. He knew this because as soon as Rattata clamped down on that small egg, the other ones started using confusion uncontrollably. And if she moved just a little bit and caused the egg she was biting to also move, the others would shift in that same direction. Which thereby also affected where the power of confusion was directed. Deciding to see if his idea would work, Ash had ordered Rattata to direct Execute toward Tangela and unleash the former's psychic power on its partner. Just before she could do so, he also had given the command for his other Rattata to leave Tangela and join her sister for support. This she did just as the cerebral power of confusion actually succeeded in taking hold of Tangela, proving his theory correct. While his friends and Liza, who felt maddeningly frustrated at her inability to do anything for either of her Pokémon, looked on, Tangela was lifted up and then slammed back down on the hard wooden battlefield, repeatedly. Rattata, showing herself to be as astute as her sister, quickly found that biting down on the egg in her mouth in different ways would affect the way in which confusion's power was directed. Biting in a hard, downward manner would cause Tangela to descend. Likewise, lifting up on the egg between her teeth would raise Tangela upward, and if she shook her head from side to side, it would send the other Pokémon shaking like a wind-driven leaf. Making use of the newfound control she had over she and her sister's shared opponent, Rattata alternately bit down and lifted up on the small egg that was utterly at her mercy. Doing this caused Tangela to be brutally slammed over and over into the ground by the power of its own partner's psychic energy. Feeling the winds of victory beginning to blow their way, Ash had swiftly called for Rattata to give a hard rightward head shake and toss Tangela at Execute. With as much force as she could muster she did as commanded, and then, As soon as Rattata had yanked the telekinetic egg to the right, she let go and jumped back. Doing that caused Execute to abruptly end confusion, but the damage was already done as Tangela was now hurtling through the air toward its teammate. Both of the Rattata sisters had scurried back a safe distance just as Tangela collided with Execute. Ash had given no time for Liza to try and make a comeback and gave the order for both Rattata to finish the assault by using a double quick attack. In perfect form and timing, the dynamic duo truly showed just how impeccable their teamwork was by charging toward their opponents like purple blurs of fur, their footfalls not even a second out of sync. At the exact same time they both slammed into Tangela and Execute, the force of the impact great enough that it sent both grass types soaring back into the netting that surrounded the battlefield. In their own form of stellar synchronization, Liza's last two Pokémon had fallen to the ground and slipped from consciousness with not so much as a blink between them. At the climactic finale of their battle, Ash had all but been bursting at the seams with pride over both of the Rattata sisters. Just like Paris, they had grown incredibly, even in the relatively short time since he had become their new trainer. And it was a pride that he had been more than happy to show by lifting both of them into his arms and hugging the victorious duo tightly, showing them just what it meant to belong to a truly loving, compassionate trainer. Liza, for her part, hadn't allowed her loss to dampen her lively spirits and showed it by unabashedly praising Ash on the perfect harmony he shared with his Pokémon. Saying that, in battle, like with nature, they were totally unpredictable and amazingly unrelenting to the very utmost. As proof of his victory over her gym, she had happily bestowed upon him the nature badge. The shiny new symbol of triumph looked a lot like an upside-down triangle that was fitted onto another triangle, of which was right side up. The entire badge was green in color and fittingly enough, it was a deep forest green. With Ash's sound wind secured over the spirited and nature-loving gym leader, he and his friends had said goodbye to Liza and then made their way back to the village proper in order to get Ash's Pokémon a well-deserved rest at the small but cozy Pokémon Center. While they had indeed stayed the night in the quaint, peaceful little town, the four of them hit the road again the very next morning after Ash had swapped his Pokémon around once more. Thus, Caston village was soon left in the wake of their footsteps with no other detour standing in the way between themselves and Vermilion City. Somewhere in Vermilion City, waiting for the glamorous luxury ship, the Saint Anne, to begin boarding passengers, was none other than Gary Oak. Being flanked as he was by his entire posse of clamoring fangirls, the brown-haired boy could be seen roaming the streets of the city while whittling time away until they could enter the ship. "Hey girls, I have to go to the Pokémon Center real quick and get Gramps to send me a Pokémon over, don't wait up." He spoke with a careless wave over his shoulder as he turned to go down an opposite street from his group. "Okay, Gary." The girls all replied in a perky chorus for the young trainer that would hopefully help whisk them into fame along with himself. As he made his way down the sidewalk, passing random faces along the way, Gary felt a sense of almost lackadaisical ease. After traveling around catching Pokémon and earning gym badges, the grandson of Professor Oak felt that he had earned a little time off. Indeed, he had no intention of even challenging the gym that was in the current city he found himself passing through. While he had no doubt that he could easily defeat the gym leader, even despite the man's reputation for being a brutally hardcore trainer with a powerhouse Raichu, he simply felt there was no need. It had only been recently that they had driven through a town with a gym that Gary earned himself a badge from. He felt rather confident and at ease with his current progress and figured a little vacation time was well deserved. He thought it to be only too convenient, therefore, that Macy, one of the older girls traveling with him, and her brother Mark, their driver, who was financing most of his journey, bought them all tickets for the SS. Anne. A few days on the luxury liner would be just what he needed to recharge himself for another flawless streak of constant victories and success. He still could not figure why his sister Daisy had been so insistent on trying to stop him from traveling with the rich clique he had found himself a part of shortly before leaving on his journey. She had tried to tell him that she knew Macy in school and that the wealthy young heiress of a sports convertible company was nothing but a shallow fame junkie. Someone who would latch onto whatever up-and-coming talent she thought might get her into the spotlight. At the mere notion, Gary could only scoff. Was it too much of a stretch to believe that someone, or even several someones, would have such faith in his great potential that they would desire to support him? He knew his sister, much like his mother, meant well, but he refused to believe that Macy, her brother and friends were merely using him. He was destined for greatness as a Pokémon trainer, being the grandson of Professor Samuel Oak, and it was only logical others would see the same thing. Arriving finally at the Pokémon Center, the confident young man made his way over to the video phones. Sitting down, he dialed in the Oak Laboratories number and, a few moments later, the face of his grandfather appeared on the screen. "Ah, Gary. Good to hear from my own grandson again. It's been a while, how are things?" The aging Pokémon expert greeted with a welcoming smile for his youngest grandchild. The younger Oak just shrugged and then smirked. "Hey, you know how it is, Gramps. Catching Pokémon, beating weak trainers and creaming every gym leader I face. What else?" The older man frowned hearing this. "Gary, you need to learn to have some humility about yourself and not be so overconfident. You are a good trainer. In fact, you and Ash are the most successful out of the four of you that left Pallet Town. However, you need to learn to respect all of your opponents and never underestimate them." He leaned forward and lifted his finger in an admonishing fashion. "Your Pokémon are also the reason why you are doing so well on your journey, it's not just you alone. You may be training them well, but they are giving their all for you because they want to make you proud." The wizened researcher crossed his arms and closed his eyes. Every great trainer should remember that it's the bond between them and their Pokémon, as well as a humble attitude, which truly causes them to shine. Gary just waved his hand dismissively. Yeah, Gramps, sure. Humility, be nice, love your Pokémon, I hear ya. But if I wasn't such a great trainer, my Pokémon wouldn't be half as strong as they are now." Leaning back in his chair, he crossed his own arms and shrugged again. "Anyway, I'm calling because I want you to send over that Krabby I caught a while back. Make it fast too, because I'm gonna have to be on the Saint. And soon." His grandfather merely sighed and shook his head. "Give me a minute, Gary." With that, he stood up and left the view of the camera to fulfill his grandson's request. While he waited, Gary just so happened to look over to the left in the screen and saw a truly gargantuan Krabby in a large glass container filled with water sitting on one of the professor's research tables. For a moment he was only able to gape in shock before finally exclaiming, "That Krabby is huge." Professor Oak himself reappeared a few moments later holding a Pokeball and put it on the teleporter pad next to his vid phone. After initiating the transfer, he nodded at his grandson. "There you are, Gary, your Krabby is on its way." The boy didn't even seem to have heard as he pointed at the screen and demanded, "Who's that Krabby belong to, Gramps?" The professor looked to where his grandson was pointing and then smiled rather excitedly. "Ah, that Krabby belongs to Ash. He is truly a unique specimen among his species, and not just in size either. I believe it to be more likely than not that his strength and overall power will be far greater than a normal Krabby. Of course, until Ash gets to work with him some, we won't know for certain." Gary looked utterly dumbfounded. "Little Ashy boy caught that Pokémon?" Professor Oak merely nodded and smiled again. "Yes, he did. He even went out of his way to call me and make sure that his Krabby made it here safely after he caught it. That boy really does love his Pokémon." After a few moments, Gary regained his composure and just smirked again. "Oh well, I guess even losers have to get some luck every now and again." The professor frowned. "I wouldn't be so quick to put Ash down, Gary. He's doing quite well for himself." His grandson merely rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, like I said, even losers get a lucky break sometimes." He then stood up and waved offhandedly at his grandfather just as his Pokeball arrived over on the teleporter pad of the Pokémon Center's transfer machine. "I gotta go, Gramps. My girls are waiting for me and so is the Ann. Don't wanna keep em waiting." Professor Oak sighed sadly once more and said farewell to his grandson before Gary ended the communication. All the older man could do afterward was shake his head and look up at the ceiling forlornly. Oh Gary, you have so much to learn. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX way to the Pokémon Center first before seeking out the Vermilion Gym. Man, this city is busy. Misty exclaimed as she had to quickly step aside in order to avoid someone who was running down the road and nearly bowled her over. No kidding. Giselle agreed as she wrapped her arm around Ash's right one and drew closer to him to keep from getting bumped or jostled by the many people walking up and down the sidewalk beside them. Wonder what's going on. Brock mused aloud. I just hope the Pokémon Center isn't too crowded. Ash sighed while Pikachu mimicked his trainer's expression, his poor little body in need of a nice long rest under a PRM before the gym battle. Thankfully, when they finally reached the rather sizable Pokémon Center that served the entire city's needs, as well as those of travelers, it was to the relieving sight of a relatively empty, quiet lobby that they walked into. Well, it's not crowded in here. Wonder if there's some kind of event going on that's not Pokémon related. Brock wondered with a hand to his chin. I don't know, maybe. I'm just glad it's not slammed in here. Ash shrugged as he walked up to the front desk, where Nurse Joy kindly greeted them and readily accepted all of their Pokeballs. Misty, of course, had to restrain Brock since the love-struck teen almost immediately tried to lunge at the pretty older woman and spout off a train of romantic dribble. Just as Pikachu eagerly leapt from his shoulder to the cart that a Chansey pushed around to collect the 4 trays of Pokeballs, Ash turned to the pink-haired nurse and asked. Excuse me, Nurse Joy, could you tell us what's going on today that has the city so busy? Looking at the young trainer who, to her eyes, physically appeared quite a bit older than he really was, smiled sweetly. Well, that would be because the Saint Anne is shipping out today. The Saint Anne, he replied with a questioning head tilt. At the mere mention, Misty's eyes seemed to light up excitedly, but Nurse Joy answered before she could. Yes, the Saint Anne is a luxury cruise liner that is setting sail today. Giselle, for her own reasons, also saw stars and clasped her hands together. A cruise liner. Oh, that sounds so luxurious and romantic. It would be wonderful to go on a ship like that. Where does it make port? Ash asked curiously. Well, on this particular trip it will be sailing across the Bay of Vermilion and through the Gyarados straight into the open ocean. From there it will stick mostly to the coast, somewhere between Fuchsia City and the Seafoam Islands, before finally making berth at Porta Vista. She raised a finger astutely, as if giving a great imparting of knowledge. You see, Porta Vista is an island located off the shores of the most eastern half of Kanto. It is separated predominantly into 2 of the largest resort cities in the region, Acapulco and Hutber Port. Misty interjected in a tone of palpable enthusiasm. I've studied all about the Saint Anne, and not only is it one of the nicest, largest luxury cruise ships in the world, it's also one of the fastest. Joy I smiled and nodded at the younger girl's added tidbit. Indeed it is. I myself am quite the cruise enthusiast as well. Due to its speed, the SS Anne can make it from here to the end of the bay at the Gyarados Strait in only a couple of hours. Ash looked back at Misty and Giselle and, seeing the whimsical gleam of longing that was reflected in their eyes, he suddenly felt a strong desire to do something about it tug at his belly. A hot, almost burning sensation that was so foreign to him it might as well have been primal, instinctive, for all he knew. All that was for certain in his young mind at that moment was that he was suddenly pulled, overwhelmingly, to take action. Regardless of how rashly he may have been about to behave or what he was preparing to do. Turning back to Nurse Joy, he asked a question that had all of his friends looking at him in surprise. Can you still book a place on the ship, Nurse Joy? She paused for a few seconds at his inquiry but then looked up at the ceiling with a finger to her chin. Well, you can't buy tickets anymore, I believe. Not this soon to cast off, but they are holding a Pokémon battle contest. The winner will receive 2 tickets to board the ship with the choice of bringing 1 guest along, per ticket. Hearing about such an opportunity that played so close to his Arceus-given strengths, he was quick to reply. Where do I sign up? She smiled brightly at his spirited response while the surprise on his three friends turned to shock. Right here actually. Would you like to sign up? He looked over Pikachu, who was still sitting on the cart, Chansey not having pushed it away yet, and smiled. What do you say, buddy? Should we enter? Almost immediately the battle-loving mouse pumped his little fist. Pikachu. Looking back at Nurse Joy, he simply gave a small chuckle. Guess that's a yes, sign me up. As she reached under the counter to pull out the necessary forms, Giselle spoke the question on all of their minds. You're actually going to try and win the tickets? He gave a modest shrug and winked at the brunette before offering a smile that was directed at both she and Misty. I'm certainly gonna try. The eyes of both girls all but seemed to become stars at his positive